Parental fatigue, burnout. If you're feeling this, we get it. But there's one thing we use when we're feeling depleted. It's called Rehydrate. Delicious electrolytes that increase blood flow to your brain, organs, and nervous system, boosting your energy without anything nasty. Magic.
Next time you're feeling flat, give Rehydrate a go. Available at Coles. It's the Happy Families Podcast, the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now. I'm Dr. Justin Coulson, and today, something a little different. Normally, I'll have a chat with Luke and Susie, the husband and wife radio duo with 3 young boys. We'll answer your questions, dramas, queries and problems and try to make your family happier. Well, I had a report come across my desk just in the last couple of weeks that really caught my attention. It was all about technology and our children. But technology not from a parent's perspective, but from the perspective of teachers, the people who are dealing with our children and tech on a daily basis almost as much, if not more than we are. Dr. Amy Graham is a psychology researcher at the University of New South Wales, and she's looked into technology use in schools, particularly for regional and remote students. And she's also researched school readiness for our little ones. Amy has previously worked as a ministerial advisor to the South Australian Minister for Education, and also as a policy advisor in education in both government and non-government sectors. And Amy joins me today to talk about this report. Now, Amy's latest research as the lead researcher on this it's the Growing Up Digital Australia report. It was conducted with the Gonski Institute for Education at UNSW. The report is based on data collected late 2019, prior to COVID, and it involved a survey of Australian teachers asking them about technology at school and at home, along with changes they've seen in the classroom in the past 3 to 5 years as technology has become increasingly utilised and part of the furniture. But before we talked tech, I asked Amy a range of questions, including this one. Amy, what percentage of teachers are noticing a big change in the way the classroom works over the last few years?
90% of educators told us that they thought the number of children with psychological, social and behavioural challenges has actually increased. 78% believe that students' ability to focus on the educational tasks that they're set has decreased. And then a whole 59% has observed a decline in students' overall readiness to learn.
So how do you measure readiness to learn?
We looked at readiness to learn through indicators like the ability to focus on the task that they're set, students' completion of work on time, punctuality and attendance at school, coming to school tired and hungry, levels of physical activity, and their empathy and resilience. And all of those indicators have decreased, according to teachers.
One of the really interesting things about this data, and I guess this is the nitpicky academic in me coming out, but when we're talking about a subjective experience and we're saying, well, what's life like now compared to what it was 3 to 5 years ago or 10 to 20 years ago, we know that people tend to, I guess, glamorize the past and maybe romanticize and become nostalgic about it, whereas what we're dealing with now is the worst it's ever been. How do you respond to that, though, from just that bias that comes from dealing with the here and now and the emotion of the moment versus, oh yeah, it wasn't so bad back then?
I mean, certainly that's a limitation of the methodology of this sort of research. But we also have to give weight to the people that are spending so much time with our kids. So educators are seeing them and are really experts in their field, and they are seeing changes over a pretty short space of time. We're not asking them to reflect back, to when they watch TV, for example. So it's quite a short space of time. So I think, them being able to give us real examples of kids not listening and not taking notes like they did a couple of years ago, wanting to be entertained all the time and have this constant access to devices even when they didn't fit the task. I think we do need to listen to those messages.
Technology is implicated in most of the challenges that the teachers have highlighted. Last year in Australia, there was a really big debate about mobile phones in schools, and several states made decisions to ban mobiles in public schools, certainly in primary school. 84% of your sample of what was pretty close to 2,000 teachers said that they perceive that digital technology is a growing distraction. Which is really curious to me because we're also seeing this really big push for technology in the classroom, and teachers are also leading the charge. Are they the same teachers? You know, they're teachers that are saying, well, technology is a problem. We don't want tech unless it's our tech the way we want it.
Yeah, in so many conversations on this issue, the positive and negative aspects are presented subjectively and focusing on these polarizing moral questions and really pitted as a one-sided argument. So I think it's important, like you've said, not to ignore the value of technology or only explore its risks and pitfalls, because it is the current reality of the world that children are growing up in, and they are growing up digitally. But we know that we needed deeper understandings of how they can affect children's lives and learning and well-being. And this is one of the reasons that I don't advocate for that blanket ban that some states have introduced. Because to do this ignores those benefits and teaches nothing about how to regulate usage or learn how to be responsible and informed, considered users. So let's go to the benefits. I mean, it's clear that technology is here to stay. And it can be really empowering for kids of all ages. So teachers use a whole range of tools to help children learn in fun and engaging ways and express their creativity and stay connected. We also know from other research that children who are tech savvy will also be better prepared for a workforce that's predominantly digital. So educators in our study reported some really positive uses of media and technology in the classroom. And 55% said that student reporting for them was enhanced by digital technologies. It also helps teachers to facilitate greater communication and collaboration with each other and with parents. So overall, I mean, we had close to half the sample believing that digital technologies actually enhanced their teaching and learning activities rather than detracting. So despite using the technology more than ever, it seemed to teachers that the skill level of children on these devices just hasn't kept step with their excessive usage. So they really lacked research skills. They might be really good at playing the games, but they're unable to search and synthesize and critique what they're seeing online.
I don't know if you've found this or not in your research, but certainly anecdotally, what I find is that work that's done on a screen, it doesn't lend itself to the same level of deep thinking as pen and paper. I know that there's some data, for example, that shows that when children are studying for memorization, pen and paper is superior. There's something about the brain processing where the written word and picking up a pen and writing something down versus typing it or reading it off a screen, there's something going on that makes the brain engage differently. So I wonder if that could be one of the reasons that there's some of these challenges that you've highlighted. And the other one that I quickly wanted to touch on as well in terms of a difficulty, you indicated that teachers are saying the children are very capable of working around or working on their devices, but they don't necessarily know very much about them. And I remember reading a book by Cal Newport, I think he wrote Deep Work, where he says giving a child an iPad or a screen and saying that you want them to get good at, understanding how technology works is like giving a toddler a Tonka truck and saying, I want you to grow up and be a mechanic.
Teachers certainly talk to us about the lack of interest in handwriting or lack of interest in doing complex mathematical computations. But on a screen, they are easier for a child perhaps to do, but they're not as impactful. So the learning's just not perhaps taking place in the same way. That note-taking, there's lots of research around to say that that's how we absorb. Certainly that's how I crammed in my year 12 on my little cue cards. So I think there's lots of excellent research in the past to show that that's a great way to learn. So I'm not sure why we're accepting this reality that's not expecting that same stuff.
The benefits, maybe just a quick summary again. Teachers are basically saying this helps us as adults, as educators, to work with one another and collaborate, and we can definitely help those who are disadvantaged in some way, whether it's through disability or additional needs, or those who are in remote and regional areas, and this is a way for us to get really great quality education, personalised and customised to their needs in a way that we previously couldn't. So there's some clear arguments for why we really want to see this. The last thing that I wanted to pick up on in terms of that response, though, to my fairly long-winded question, was that you suggested that the bans on mobile phones at school is something that you're not a supporter of. Now, I'm the kind of guy who's very much against high levels of regulation. I think that we want to give people autonomy. We want to help our children to learn how to develop and use what's in their environment in effective ways. And so I'm the last person who would typically support this particular ban. And let's speak specifically about primary school students, because that's where the bans have been centred, particularly the one that got most of the attention, which was in Victoria. What is it about that ban that you don't feel good about? And maybe I can preface your response by quickly telling you why I decided to support it. So I looked at it and I thought, well, first of all, they're primary school kids, so how badly do they really need to be connected to somebody anyway? I know that there's a very small percentage of kids who may have really legitimate needs, and if that's the case, then perhaps the school can address that on a case-by-case basis. But the device is going to be implicated in and at the foundation of inattention, behaviour problems, bullying, difficulty learning, processing, gaming, social issues. I mean, I just can't see any advantage to maintaining the status quo. I think the ban simply makes sense to help children to be focused, especially in those primary school years. What's the argument, the strongest argument against the ban and allowing autonomy in this area?
I think, like you've alluded to, it's a really complex issue, that ban, and I think it's easy to get caught up in the headline. And I guess one of my arguments is a little bit political. I mean, the $12 million on lockers for the ban in Victoria was one argument. I thought as an investment of government funds, I think there could be better ones that teach children about how to regulate their usage and be those responsible users. Look at the curriculum around teaching about digital habits, I think, is another potential. So I guess, yes, one is the sheer cost and the investment, but the other is the learning that takes place. And we know that with parenting and raising children generally, that we need to engage them in those decisions, and we need to give them a voice and a little bit of opportunity to show us that they're doing the right thing. So I know that's more of a personal position than a professional one, but I don't support it as a position, or I certainly wouldn't like to see it, my children stopping using their devices because there's a ban in place. I'd like them to have a bit of a deeper conversation around why we don't use them at school.
Yeah, I think that we can actually probably do both, and my position is maybe a little more moderate than I made it out to be. The $12 million on lockers is preposterous. There has to be a better way to do it than that. But aside from the $12 million spend that some lucky subcontractor picked up to supply all of those lockers to schools, it seems to me that we have a conversation with the kids and we explain what the expectations and the rules are. And if the children in class choose not to follow those rules and expectations, in the same way that, no swinging on chairs, for example, we don't just ban chairs because the kids are swinging on it. So we need to do both. But my sense is that by removing the distraction, it just makes it so much easier to do everything else that matters. And as children get older, they begin to develop the willpower and a deeper understanding as well. Anyway, I'm grateful for you sharing that. Let's move on to my big question here. This is one of the things that I've been wrestling with for years, and it really played out in relation to what teachers were saying about students, about our children and their technology use. So essentially, when it comes to tech in the home, we are, as a nation, just dismal at keeping to the current national screen recommendation guidelines. Now, I have some pretty strong opinions about that, which we'll probably get into shortly anyway, but Anthea Rhodes has collected a whole lot of data. She runs the Child Health Poll through the Royal Children's Hospital, and her data shows that the typical Aussie child spends more than 4.5 hours per day on screens. Now, that's not including pandemic parenting. That's not including the screen time that we're now experiencing or have been experiencing as children are on their devices all day for school. So that's not including schoolwork. So 2 questions about the Child Health Poll data. First of all, why are we struggling with this so badly? Like, are our guidelines just too stringent? Why do we seem to just overachieve in terms of the amount of time that our children are spending on screens? But second, how big of a deal is it that these guidelines are being ignored?
Yeah, I love this question because I think there's a few issues, and I'll start by emphasising that it does matter. We can't keep ignoring that we have a problem with following these guidelines, and concerns about these screens and digital media aren't going away, and they are pretty much the number one worry of us all for the next generation. So I think, as well as expecting changes from teachers, parents and students and kids in this, part of the change might come from those recommendations that are in place. It may be that the minutage and the time-based guidelines are perhaps too narrow. And this approach just isn't keeping with the dynamic and complex situation. So the American Academy of Pediatrics anticipated that, the generational shift that was coming and amended their guidelines to not only provide those time-based recommendations, but also broader advice about forming healthy media habits and also the quality of screen time, recognising that an hour of watching YouTube videos is not really the same as an hour spent doing a digital art program.
Right.
And these current guidelines don't reflect those differences. I firmly believe that the problem isn't the technology and the media. It is our own inability to understand those benefits and perils. And that's what leads to the problems. So those time-based restrictions don't really teach those subtleties. And in that way, I'm not sure that they are the most sustainable solution. So later, I'd love to have a chat about alternate ways we could set guidelines and teach the healthy screen time habits.
Yeah, well, let's dive into that just now, because I've always, for the last 10 years, I feel like I've been saying again and again, and it's not about how much, it's about what type. I mean, recently, Andrew Shabilsky from the Oxford Institute of Technology, at Oxford, Andy is just one of the really interesting thinkers in this area. And he said, we don't have conversations with our kids about how much food time they've had today. We understand the difference between food that should be consumed consistently every day and food that should be consumed maybe once a week or once a month or every so often, sometimes food. And it seems to me that we've kind of missed that nuance when it comes to screens. And we've essentially said, screens, bad. You're reading a book, good, without recognising the complexity associated with the tasks and that kind of thing. So I've always had a really big gripe with the American Association of Pediatrics or the Australian governmental guidelines around this. To me, it's nonsense to say this many hours is okay and this many hours are not. Recognising, of course, that there's unequivocal data from around the world that once you get north of about sort of 4 or 5 hours a day of screen time, it is going to have a negative developmental impact on well-being and on other variables in children's lives.
You're right. The idea of screen time at the moment obscures that richness. We've got some great people in Australia like Christy Goodwin and Professor Tony Oakley that also take that similar philosophy. And the premise is that there are productive and positive uses of digital media and devices. And then there's other more passive and even dangerous sort of activities when you do too much of them. There's a time for screens, but it shouldn't be at the expense of time spent playing outside or connecting with people in real time. So we also, even in the Growing Up Digital Australia research, we looked at the well-being of kids across the whole breadth of outcomes, but we can't and shouldn't definitively or exclusively attribute that to their technology usage. And I think sometimes it's a confusing position. It's not a binary one or the other. I think if we can teach that balanced approach, that's the way that I'd like to see this conversation going forward.
What are the risk factors and protective factors of kids who are using screens too much? When you look at demographic characteristics, and I know this is a very blunt instrument, but who are the kids that are most at risk? Who are the kids that are most likely to be just fine regardless of their screen time habits?
In previous research as well as ours, it has been shown that screen time is higher in families with lower incomes. And they're also, unfortunately, the most at risk of those negative consequences. So like the poorer friendships and the lower academic performance and concentration. And those negative consequences do compound and get worse over time. And so often does the usage. So it's quite a slippery slope. And if you haven't got those right habits from the start, it's much harder to wind that usage back once you realise there's a problem.
Yeah, and something that I've looked at fairly carefully here, and I feel so frustrated and so desperate for those families that are struggling with this, is they might have lower incomes, but they're usually working longer hours to get those lower incomes, but they're in the lower paid jobs. Or we've got a single mum or a single dad who's just not able to be at home or is working 2 jobs or doing everything that they can to provide for their family, but therefore they're not able to provide the level of supervision that they want. So we've got all these structural things that are making it so hard for these, well, frankly, for the poorer families, the lower socioeconomic group, who want to be helping their children, and so they're going to work to earn the money to look after things, but that means that the children are often left to their own devices, literally, which means that screen time goes up. And it's one of those interesting things in the data where we can't necessarily say, well, it's because of screen time or it's because of X, Y, or Z, because all of these factors work together kids that come from these perhaps poorer backgrounds may struggle a little more socially or struggle a little more academically anyway. And then we're throwing extra screen time in on top of that, and people are saying, oh, the kids are on screens too much, but it could be any number of these factors. But it seems that all these kinds of things, they hang together, they mix in together. Would that be a reasonable thing to say?
I think so. I mean, unfortunately, we do know that in that digital divide, the traditional digital divide was perhaps the kids that could afford technology and might not be able to. But now we've got the digital divide going across with that educational divide. So we're seeing the higher and lower performing students, the gap between those students is increasing. And then often we've got those same children coming to school with the poor screen time habits. They may have had a little bit more of the digital babysitter. And once again, I'm so cautious in saying that because we all do it. I'm really trying to be kind to parents in understanding this issue. There's nothing to be gained from allocating blame or anything like that. But if children do see it as a source of entertainment and have unregulated, unfettered use of these devices, it's quite hard to wind that back. And we're putting that on teachers. Teachers aren't trained to deal with exclusively online bullying, harassment, the issues of distraction, taking screens off them. They're not trained in that. Neither are parents. But there's a real confusion we found with the teachers in our study that where does their jurisdiction end? Where can they influence parents and try to help them understand the risks and perhaps a better way to use screens in the home?
It's a vexed issue. It kind of leads into a bigger conversation, and I want to spend a couple of minutes on this because I don't think we're going to solve the problems of the world just highlighting the systemic and structural challenges. There are some fierce, and I mean really almost vitriolic academic arguments that are going on in psychology right now, primarily between Andy Chabulski, who I mentioned earlier, and he's at Oxford with one of his collaborators, Amy Orban, and Jean, I don't know if it's Twenge or Twenge, I'll have to ask her, at San Diego, and her collaborators, and one of the world's foremost psychology thinkers, John Haidt, has just joined the fray and seems to be aligning himself fairly closely with what Jean Twenge is saying. But essentially, Andy's saying that how many potatoes you eat each day probably have a bigger effect on well-being than how much screen time you're getting. And Jean's saying that life changed in 2012 when screens became ubiquitous and everybody had them. Now, anecdotally, it feels as if Jean's right. And the teachers in your study in the Growing Up Digital Australia report almost without question leaned in that direction. One of them said, and I quote, "There is increasing anxiety among students. Some cases are severe. 25 years ago, this was very rare, with 1 or 2 students in an entire school suffering anxiety. Now it's common to have several students with depression and anxiety in every year group." And another one said, "As a teacher, I have certainly noticed the large number of students in my classes with diagnosed mental health issues. I've also noticed many students struggle to not be in constant contact with their phone." So what I saw when I was reading through the Growing Up Digital Australia technical report was that teachers essentially are saying, yep, things are getting worse in the classroom. Children are struggling more psychologically and emotionally and socially and in all these other ways. The classroom condition has become more complex. And they're really siding with Jean Twenge and saying, and we think that it's happened in the last few years and we think that it's because of screens. So what advice would you offer to parents and educators around this issue? I mean, is it screens? Is Jean right or is Andy right? Where do you position yourself in, and what kind of advice do you give around this?
Oh, I think like most things, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle of those polarizing binary sort of options. But I mean, with her findings, with the have smartphones destroyed a generation, I can see how Twenge's research has been conceived as one-sided and alarmist and maybe a step too far. But she also makes the point that her research is correlational. So it didn't intend to look at a causal link between screen time and the negative consequences. But a bit like ours in Growing Up Digital, we don't seek causation either. So we're looking at what Australian educators are saying about the wellbeing outcomes of kids across a whole range of outcomes. They're also looking at the changes in screen use. Now, those have both gone in a really common sense direction. So while we've seen the screen time go up and the distraction in the classroom increase, we can't still say that they're causally linked. But should we be listening to those people that spend a lot of time with our kids about their concerns? Absolutely, we should.
So let's get a bit geeky for just a sec then, because what I find really compelling about Twenge's research is that she's using very large data sets. She's also doing longitudinal research, which it doesn't say that A is causing B, but she's got a whole lot of variables that are all pointing in the same direction. And what they're all essentially pointing to is that, in fact, the way that I kind of try to balance the two arguments is, I like her argument. I think that it's stronger. But Andy's a really sharp researcher, and his insights are, he's not doing this to be contentious. He's a smart and switched-on guy. I've had the privilege of listening to him at conferences previously, and even having some one-on-one conversations with him at those conferences around some of these issues. So I know how sharp this guy is. He's basically saying you can't blame screens. You might as well blame how many potatoes you eat. And she's saying, well, hang on, screens are implicated in all of this. And as I look at it, what I feel is that there's a common element underneath all of these issues. It may not actually be screens that are causing social problems. It may not actually be screens that are causing distraction and drama and all sorts of these dilemmas, because we can't say that it's causal. But we can say that screens are implicated and are potentially at the foundation of each of these issues. Do you think that that's a reasonable position to maintain?
I do, and that's certainly the premise of our research. Despite it being anecdotal, we did observe trends happening at the same time, and that's compelling.
So I guess that's probably a pretty neat place for us to wrap things up. There's clearly good. We've talked about good in the classroom and in life when it comes to screens. We've talked about the bad, and while we haven't dwelled on that, everybody's aware that there are some real challenges associated with screen usage. And we've talked about a bit of the ugly as well. But if you're going to give maybe your last advice to parents and teachers who are grappling with how to best manage screens, what would you advise? Where do you think the Growing Up Digital Australia report points us in terms of helping our children to avoid those bad and ugly outcomes and get the very best out of their screen usage, especially since there's so much of it as a result of COVID-19?
For my family, I love screen time followed by green time. So really, the balance in my family really matters. But whatever you choose, whether it be the time-based guidelines or whatever it is that you choose, try and give kids a voice and some buy-in at the decision-making table about this. If they help to make the rules, as we know, they'd be a lot more likely to follow them. Try to follow them as consistently as possible, as tempting as it is when, kids can be begging and bargaining for more time, or you really do need that break when you need to get something done. Try to be as firm and consistent as possible.
Great. So the takeaway really is know what's going on, set appropriate limits, make sure that your kids are using screens more for creation and connection than consumption, and do your best to just be across it. It's less about the device and more about what they're doing in their lives. If they can have a whole and balanced life. It almost sounds like it's getting back to common sense.
It is. I think when we look at what the antidotes to screens, which is why I love this green time followed by screen time, being outside, they don't have to be one or the other. A great afternoon probably for a child is, making a pic collage of some of their favourite photos, followed by playing on the swing and then maybe reading a book, cooking a meal with a parent. So I think we all strive for that balance in our families.
It sounds like a good afternoon for me, let alone for the kids. I like the sound of that. Amy, it's been an absolute delight talking with you. Really appreciate your generosity in sharing this research with us. And where to next with the Growing Up Digital Australia research? I can't imagine that this is a one-off.
No, it's not. So phase 2 is actually going to be giving this voice to parents and grandparents. We really want to understand the issues from their perspective. We feel like we've got a reasonable handle now on what's going on in schools, but we want to understand more about what parents are seeing in their children and the kinds of relationships they're observing between the children's screen time and any changes that are taking place. I urge all parents and grandparents to get on board and have a go at it when it comes out later in the year, hopefully. Well,
that sounds great. Make sure you send that my way and I'll share it with my followers on Facebook and encourage them all to give you the very best data that we can.
It was so great talking to you. Thank you.
Amy, it's been a delight talking with you. Really appreciate it. This is Dr. Amy Graham, the lead investigator in the Growing Up Digital Australia report from the Gonski Institute for Education at the University of New South Wales. Thank you so much, Amy. And we'll have more special interviews and conversations as the podcast grows and develops. You've probably noticed that we're doing a few things differently there. If you've enjoyed this interview and the podcast generally, please jump onto Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from and leave a rating and a review. It helps them to find the podcast as well. And for more information, happyfamilies.com.au or my Facebook page, Dr. Justin Coulson's Happy Families.